Story 1.
My friend Lucas and I have always had a thing for outdoor adventures, but I admit that time we went beyond the limit of common sense. The idea was simple: get to the famous viewpoint that everyone talked about, but avoid the official trail, which looked more like an amusement park queue because it was so busy. It was then that someone in the camping group mentioned a shortcut that went through a restricted area of the forest. There were no signs, but they assured us that it was a maximum 2-hour walk. The two of us, being young and thinking nothing could go wrong, grabbed our backpacks and headed straight there. As soon as we entered the improvised trail, the environment already seemed different. The trees were denser, and the silence was so heavy that every branch snap sounded like a gunshot. We walked for almost an hour and started to realize that it didn't seem as simple as they said. The sun was starting to set, and the surrounding vegetation was getting thicker. That's where Lucas saw the cabin first. It was a little away from the trail, practically hidden among the trees. It was small, made of aged wood, and had a fragile appearance, as if it could collapse in a strong wind. I told us to keep walking, but curiosity was stronger. "Let's just take a quick look," Lucas said, and, against my instinct, I agreed. As we got closer, I noticed that the cabin didn't look as abandoned as we first thought. A clothesline, with what looked like dirty cloth hanging from it, swayed in the wind, and there were footsteps in the dirt around it. The door was ajar, and the smell that came from it as we approached made me uncomfortable. It was a mix of damp wood, mold, and something I couldn't identify, maybe rotten food. Lucas pushed the door open carefully, and the creak echoed in a way that made my nerves fray. The interior was even worse than we imagined. There was a makeshift table with open cans of food, some still with remains. A sleeping bag was thrown in the corner, empty but stretched out tightly, as if someone had just left there. There was also an old radio, turned off, and a bucket with water, half full. "I think someone lives here," I whispered, even though I knew it was obvious. The atmosphere of curiosity turned into tension, and all I wanted was to get out of there as quickly as possible. Before we could turn around, we heard a noise. It was low at first, but seemed to get closer. Something or someone was walking in the forest, and the footsteps were heavy enough to break branches. It wasn't a small animal, that's for sure. Lucas froze in place, and I felt my heart race. We ran to the door, trying to see where the sound was coming from, but the forest was so thick we couldn't see anything. I told him quietly to leave, but he didn't move. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a strange sound, like a low murmur that seemed to come from several directions at once. It was at that moment that I realized what was missing. The sleeping bag was empty, but the owners of that cabin might be returning. I pulled Lucas by the arm, and he finally started to move, but each step felt like a sacrifice. We were trying to get out as quickly and quietly as possible, but the sound of branches breaking behind us only grew louder. I looked back reflexively and almost lost my balance. I couldn't see anyone, but I swear I saw something moving among the trees, like a shadow too big to be an ordinary animal. My heart felt like it was exploding in my chest, and my only thought was that we needed to get back to the main trail, no matter what. Only, instead of moving away from danger, it felt like we were walking in circles, as if the forest had swallowed the way back. It was then that the murmur became clearer. It was low and uneven, like a person trying to whisper something but you couldn't make out the words. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, because the sound seemed to be all around us, as if the entire forest was whispering to us. Suddenly, the sound stopped. We stood still too, hearing only our heavy breathing and the crickets in the distance. For a moment, I thought it was paranoia, that we were overreacting, and that maybe no one was there. That's when a loud crack, very close this time, made me turn towards the noise. There was something there. It wasn't a person. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was big, standing among the trees, as if it were watching us. Without thinking twice, we started running. Adrenaline took over, and the sound of our feet crunching dry leaves seemed deafening. I didn't know where we were going. I just wanted to get as far away from the cabin and that thing as possible. The forest seemed to close in even more, with low-hanging branches scratching our arms and faces as we advanced. Lucas tripped and fell, letting out a muffled scream. As I turned to help him, I heard the murmur again, this time much closer. He seemed to come straight from behind us, but there was no one thereat, at least no one that I could see. I hurriedly lifted Lucas, and we continued running, ignoring the pain and fatigue. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, we finally found a more open space in the forest. Late afternoon light illuminated a clearing, and for a second I thought we were safe. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps coming from different directions, as if we were surrounded. The murmur came again, louder now, almost like a buzzing sound, and I felt my vision blur. Lucas started to mumble something, but I couldn't understand. Before I could react, a quick movement caught my attention. A shadow passed through my peripheral vision, and my instinct was to turn around. But there was nothing there. Just silence. Absolute silence. The silence was suddenly broken by a low scream coming from inside the forest. It wasn't ours. It wasn't human. It was as if someone was in agony, but in a distorted way, a kind of wail that made the skin on all my hairs stand on end. The sound seemed to swirl around us, as if we were being watched from all sides. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. The clearing that once seemed like our exit now seemed like a trap. A bait in the middle of a nightmare. I looked at Lucas, who was pale, glassy-eyed. He was no longer in the same place as before. He was there physically, but his expression was otherworldly, as if he had been touched by something I couldn't see. Before I could ask what was happening to him, I felt a weight on my back, as if someone had placed a hand on my shoulder. But there was no one. My body froze, and my stomach turned. It was an indescribable feeling, as if something invisible was trying to trap us in that place. I didn't want to look around anymore. I didn't want to hear the whispers or the sound of stealthy footsteps anymore. I wanted to return to the safety of camp, to the noise of other people, to normalcy. But when I looked back at Lucas, he was already walking away, as if he were being drawn by a force I couldn't understand. He didn't hear me when I called, and that made me wonder, what was that thing? What was trying to take us into the forest? I ran towards him, screaming, but he didn't seem to hear me. His steps were getting faster and faster, almost as if he was no longer in control of his own body. I felt indescribable terror, and something inside me knew that if I didn't act quickly, I would lose Lucas forever. When I finally caught up with him, he was standing in a part of the forest where the vegetation seemed thicker. The sound of the murmur was louder, almost deafening, and I could almost swear it was coming from underground, from within the roots of the trees. I pulled his arm, but he was different. His eyes were empty, as if he was in a trance. He didn't react. He just looked at me with a deep, disconnected emptiness, as if he was no longer the person I knew. It was at that moment that suddenly everything stopped. The buzzing is gone. The whispers stopped. The forest, once full of life and sounds, fell into absolute silence. The only thing I could hear was the beat of my own heart and the sound of my breathing. And it was in this silence that I saw. It was not a movement, nor a shadow. It was like a presence, something that was so close you could feel it. It was as if the forest was alive, and a part of it was watching us, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I tried to pull Lucas again, but when I looked at him, I realized he was no longer standing. He just disappeared. He was no longer by my side. I stood there, not understanding what had happened. The ground was solid beneath my feet, but it felt like reality had distorted. Where was Lucas? Where was the sound, the footsteps, the presence that I had felt? I looked around desperately, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees and the gloom that was forming. My body was frozen, but my mind wouldn't stop screaming. I needed to find a way out, but the forest seemed to have closed in even more, and I didn't know where to go. That's when I heard it again, the murmur. It was no longer just a whisper. Now it was a voice that sounded tired. He said my name, but with a tone that was not that of a human. I turned around again, and that's when I saw it. It was not a shadow, nor something intangible. It was a figure, a presence that was standing before me at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see details, but the feeling that something was there, watching, was undeniable. The figure seemed misshapen, as if nature itself was taking a human form, but deformed, with contours that didn't make sense. I couldn't stop looking, even though I knew it was a mistake. It was as if there was something hypnotic about that being, something that held me there, prevented me from running. The murmur became stronger, clearer, until I finally managed to understand what the voice was saying. "You are lost." It was simple, but the way it was said sent a chill down my spine. The figure didn't move, but something in me knew. She knew exactly what was happening. I was there, trapped, with no way out, and now completely at the mercy of something I couldn't understand. I looked around, looking for a way to escape, but the trees seemed to form a wall around me. The clearing where I was before had become a dead-end space, and the feeling that I was being watched intensified. My head was a mess, and despair began to take over. I needed to get out of there, but somehow, the more I tried, the more the forest seemed to swallow me. That's when I heard the sound of something moving behind me. It wasn't the murmurs, nor the sound of footsteps. It was something else, something heavy, as if the earth itself were moving. My vision blurred for a second, and when I blinked, I found myself back on the main trail. The clearing, the figure, the footsteps, everything disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if it had never existed. I was there, alone, without Lucas, without understanding what had happened. My head was spinning, and everything seemed unreal. I ran to the camp without looking back, and when I arrived, the relief was instantaneous. But I knew something wasn't right. The forest hadn't let me go, and I didn't know how long I would be safe. Over the next few days, I looked for Lucas. I asked everyone at the camp, but no one knew anything. They didn't see anything strange. Everything seemed normal to them. But I knew that what I experienced could not be ignored. I found no more signs of Lucas, neither on the trail nor in the surrounding forest. It was as if he had disappeared completely, swallowed by the same presence that almost took me. I returned to the city, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still hear the murmur, that distorted sound that I don't know where it comes from, and I feel as if something is following me. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that forest. People talk about the mysteries of restricted areas, about places where nature seems to have a life of its own, but I never thought I would actually experience something like this. The cabin, the footsteps, the figure. I don't know what it was, but whatever happened, it happened so quickly, without warning, that to this day I feel lost. And, as much as I try to forget, Lucas's name haunts me whenever I remember those hours. What happened to it? Was he consumed, taken by it? Or was he already destined to disappear before we even entered that forest? I don't know, and I may never know. All I know is that that experience impacted me in a way I can't explain. I don't have the courage to go back there to look for answers.
Story 2.
I was camping alone in a small spot near the Fort Bragg military base in North Carolina. I never thought I would have an experience like that there. The place seemed peaceful, surrounded by trees and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I am a nature lover and have spent the night in several campsites, but that night something was strange. The silence, which would normally be comforting, felt tense, as if something was watching. It was already close to 3 a.m., and I was starting to fall asleep when I was abruptly woken up by a scream. It was a loud, aggressive sound, something that seemed to come from an angry man. But what scared me most was the intensity of it. It wasn't normal to hear something like that in the middle of nowhere, much less at that time. Before I could process what was happening, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew that whatever it was approaching fast. Fear began to consume me. At first, I thought it might be someone in the area, another camper who had made a noise, or even an animal. But as the screams got closer, I realized it wasn't like that at all. Suddenly, 4 men in camouflage uniforms and armed to the teeth appeared between the trees. They didn't seem to be there to talk. One of them shouted at me, accusing me of being a trespasser, or worse, a poacher. They were furious, and the tone of voice they used left no doubt that the situation was about to get out of control. I could barely understand what was happening. I was still lying there, completely paralyzed with fear. The feeling of disorientation was quick. I just knew something was wrong, but I couldn't put the pieces together. One of the men, with a serious face and an expression of anger, pointed to my tent and ordered me to leave immediately. The strangest thing, however, was when he looked at my equipment and said something about it looking exactly like a poacher's equipment. I was in shock, trying to understand how someone could have mistaken my camping backpack and small hunting knife for something else. The silence that lasted for a few seconds was more frightening than any scream. I was feeling incredibly vulnerable. How did they know I was there? How were they so sure I was an intruder? My mind was spinning when one of the officers started to move deeper into the camp, closer to the tree line. That's when he shouted, "Here! I found the tracks!" The guy seemed to have found something, and panic took over me. I didn't know what was going on, but it was becoming very clear that things were going too far. They had found something I had never noticed, something that seemed to be on the edge of the campground. When one of them pulled a piece of hunting equipment from the ground, a wire trap, my stomach turned. I had never seen that in my life. Not only had I not put it there, I didn't even know something like that could be so close to my camp. The worst of all was that they started to look at me with an even more suspicious expression, as if I were lying. The climate became unsustainable. The men were nervous and impatient, and I could barely give a convincing explanation. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. They were starting to see me as a threat. The screams, the looks, and that strange feeling in the air told me I was in danger. The most surreal thing was that I had never experienced anything like this, not even close. I was just there to camp, spend a peaceful night in the middle of nature. But the sight of the armed officers, with their flashlights pointed at me, made me feel like I was in a completely different situation, like I was the enemy. One of them stepped forward and, with a threatening look, said, "Don't try to escape. We know who you are." And that's what confused me even more. How could they know anything about me? That phrase wouldn't leave my head as the officers surrounded me. It was as if everything around had stopped for a moment. The wind that had previously blown calmly now seemed to have ceased, and even the sounds of the forest were muffled. They were accusing me of being something I wasn't, of doing something I would never do. But how could anyone be so sure of something like that? The truth is that I didn't even know what was happening, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong made me increasingly uneasy. As one of the officers approached even closer, almost towards me, I could hear the distant sound of more heavy footsteps coming through the forest. The sound was clear and unmistakable, as if more people were arriving. The footsteps were getting closer, and the fear I was feeling turned into real panic. I could barely think straight, but I knew I couldn't let them get any closer. I was starting to realize that something wasn't right, that this whole situation was much more than just a mess. The officer closest to me seemed to feel it too, and his eyes narrowed, as if something was suspicious about him too. They were waiting for something, and I was sure they were being guided by something beyond logic. It was as if they already knew I was there for some specific reason. One of the officers whispered something to the others, something I couldn't quite understand, but it seemed to completely alter their behavior. The scariest thing, however, was when the oldest member of the team looked at me and, with an expression I will never forget, asked, "What are you doing here?" Before I could respond, they began searching my tent. I was still unresponsive, my body paralyzed by tension. They took everything, my backpack, my knife, even my tent, and started searching everything with almost military speed. When they were finally finished, the older officer signaled to the others, and for a second, the tension eased. But it was only for a second. He turned to me and, with a look that conveyed genuine fear, said, "We knew someone would be here." Those words cut me like a knife. What did he mean by that? They were prepared for this. So the only thing I could ask, in a shaky voice, was, "Why?" He hesitated for a moment, and before he answered, a sound of something moving in the trees made me jump. Something was approaching, something big and heavy, and the officers seemed to be expecting it. The sound coming from the forest was unmistakable. There were heavy footsteps, as if something much larger than any human being was approaching. The officers, upon hearing it, tensed up, as if they'd been waiting for that moment. They began to organize quickly and efficiently, positioning themselves around the camp, weapons drawn. I, on the other hand, could only stare into the darkness of the trees, trying to understand what was happening. Fear consumed me completely. What was that sound? What was coming towards us? I had never felt so scared in my life, and the worst part was that I didn't know where to run. There was no escape, and it was then that, in the silence that followed, I heard a voice coming from one of the officers who whispered, "Be still, he is here." What did he mean by that? Was it referring to something? Somebody? I could barely process it all. The atmosphere had completely changed, and the feeling that everything was about to explode at any moment was overwhelming. They were expecting something, and I had no idea what it was. Then suddenly, a scream cut through the night, coming from the direction of the forest. The scream wasn't human. It was something more primal, frightening, as if a gigantic animal was in agony. I almost fell back, but I stayed upright, rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness. It was at that moment that I realized the true horror of that night. The officers were more terrified than I was. They were terrified of what was coming, but they couldn't get out of there. They were prepared to face something, but what? And why was it happening right there? At that time, that night, the scream echoed again, closer this time. The tension was unbearable, and even the air felt heavy. I was paralyzed, but the officers were beginning to move, heading toward the forest carefully, as if they were on a mission. They were still trying to maintain control of the situation, but it was clear that they were more scared than any of us should have been. I could see the look of despair on their faces, as if they already knew that what was there was not something they could deal with easily. One of them, the youngest, looked at the others and said in a trembling voice, "We need to leave now." But the leader, the oldest, stopped him with a firm gesture. "We can't. We are already here. Wait for him." It was the only thing he said. Those words disconcerted me even more. Who was this he they were talking about? What was coming? Then, suddenly, a gigantic shadow crossed the tree line in front of us. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel the presence of it, as if something was approaching with uncontrollable force. The sight of the shadow was like a materialized nightmare. Neither of us moved. Our eyes were fixed on the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. But nothing compared to that. A deep, almost deafening sound began to resonate, like the roar of an unknown creature. The officers began to crouch, even more tense, and even the sounds of nature around us fell silent. I could only hear my heart beating in my chest and the sound of those huge footsteps getting closer and closer. And before I could react, the shadow disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving only silence and a feeling that something very strange had happened. The sound coming from the forest was unmistakable. There were heavy footsteps, as if something much larger than any human being was approaching. The officers, upon hearing it, tensed up, as if they'd been waiting for that moment. They began to organize quickly and efficiently, positioning themselves around the camp, weapons drawn. I, on the other hand, could only stare into the darkness of the trees, trying to understand what was happening. Fear consumed me completely. What was that sound? what was coming towards us. I had never felt so scared in my life, and the worst part was that I didn't know where to run. There was no escape, and it was then that, in the silence that followed, I heard a voice coming from one of the officers who whispered, "Be still, he is here." What did he mean by that? Was it referring to something? Somebody? I could barely process it all. The atmosphere had completely changed, and the feeling that everything was about to explode at any moment was overwhelming. They were expecting something, and I had no idea what it was. Then suddenly, a scream cut through the night, coming from the direction of the forest. The scream wasn't human. It was something more primal, frightening, as if a gigantic animal was in agony. I almost fell back, but I stayed upright, rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness. It was at that moment that I realized the true horror of that night. The officers were more terrified than I was. They were terrified of what was coming, but they couldn't get out of there. They were prepared to face something, but what? And why was it happening right there? At that time, that night, the scream echoed again, closer this time. The tension was unbearable, and even the air felt heavy. I was paralyzed, but the officers were beginning to move, heading toward the forest carefully, as if they were on a mission. They were still trying to maintain control of the situation, but it was clear that they were more scared than any of us should have been. I could see the look of despair on their faces, as if they already knew that what was there was not something they could deal with easily. One of them, the youngest, looked at the others and said in a trembling voice, "We need to leave now." But the leader, the oldest, stopped him with a firm gesture. "We can't. We are already here. Wait for him." It was the only thing he said. Those words disconcerted me even more. Who was this he they were talking about? What was coming? Then, suddenly, a gigantic shadow crossed the tree line in front of us. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel the presence of it, as if something was approaching with uncontrollable force. The sight of the shadow was like a materialized nightmare. Neither of us moved. Our eyes were fixed on the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. But nothing compared to that. A deep, almost deafening sound began to resonate, like the roar of an unknown creature. The officers began to crouch, even more tense, and even the sounds of nature around us fell silent. I could only hear my heart beating in my chest and the sound of those huge footsteps getting closer and closer. And before I could react, the shadow disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving only silence and a feeling that something very strange had happened.
Story 3.
I've never shared this before because, honestly, I still get butterflies just thinking about it. It happened last summer when 3 friends from college, Mike, Sarah, and Josh, and I decided to take a camping trip to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. We had already done several trails there before, but this time we wanted to spend a few days camping, enjoying that vibe of nature and disconnection. I remember exchanging looks with Mike at that time, trying to hide my discomfort. Josh, who had always been the most skeptical of the group, got up and walked around the camp with his flashlight, saying that there were probably other campers nearby. But there was no one. What made me most uneasy was that every time Josh shined the flashlight in one direction, the sounds seemed to come from the opposite direction. It was as if, whatever it was playing with us. After about 20 minutes of this, we decided to enter the tents. We agreed to sleep in pairs, Mike and I in one, Sarah and Josh in the other. No one admitted it, but it was obvious that everyone was too scared to sleep alone. Inside the tent, I couldn't relax. The sleeping bag felt suffocating, and every noise outside made my heart race. Around midnight, Mike nudged me and pointed to the wall of the tent. You could clearly see the shadow of someone standing there, cast by the moonlight. It wasn't an animal shadow, it was definitely a human figure. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The shadow stayed there, completely still, for at least 5 minutes. Then, suddenly, it was gone. Soon after, We heard Sarah whispering from the other tent, asking if we had also seen that. Nobody slept that night. When the sun finally started to rise, around 5:30 a.m., we were the first to leave the tents. The atmosphere was heavy, and no one could really look each other in the eye. I think everyone was feeling a little stupid for having been so scared during the night. Josh suggested making coffee so we could wake up and try to laugh about it all. But when he went out to get water from the stream, he came running back, white as paper. He had found footprints. These weren't normal prints from hiking boots or sneakers. They were deep marks, as if someone was wearing some kind of old military boot. And the worst part, they formed a perfect circle around our tents, as if someone had spent the entire night walking around our campsite. It was Sarah who noticed the most disturbing detail. There were only footprints leading up to our campsite, but no footprints back, as if the person was still there. Mike started photographing everything with his cell phone, his hands shaking so much that some photos came out blurry. I followed the footprints for a few meters. They came straight from the densest part of the forest, where there were no marked trails. At some points, you could see that the person had stopped and stayed in the same place for a while, probably watching us. The strangest thing is that in some areas, the grass was completely crushed, as if someone had laid down there to keep a better eye on us. By now, everyone was in a silent panic. We started packing our things as quickly as possible, knocking everything over, tripping over tent ropes. Nobody said anything, but you could feel that everyone was paying attention to any movement in the forest. That's when I noticed something that chilled my spine. Our backpacks. We always left them outside the tents, covered with a tarp because of the calm. Now, looking in daylight, you could see that someone had tampered with them. They hadn't stolen anything. But it was visible that the backpacks were in different positions, and the tarp was folded in a different way than we had left it. Sarah began to silently cry when she opened her backpack and found a pine branch carefully placed on top of all her things. It wasn't a branch that had fallen there by chance. It was positioned in a very specific way, as if it were a macabre gift. Mike started vomiting when he saw this, and Josh, who had always been the calmest of the group, finally lost his composure. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted. And for the first time since we arrived, his voice echoed through the forest. The echo was followed by absolute silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. And then, far away, we heard laughter. A human laugh, low but perfectly audible. We have never dismantled camp so quickly in our lives. Our hands were shaking so much that we could barely fold the tents properly. We ended up stuffing everything in our backpacks haphazardly. The whole time I had the feeling that there were eyes watching us from somewhere in the trees. The worst thing is that now, with daylight, it was possible to see several points in the vegetation where the bushes were crushed, forming small nests for observation. This person, or whoever it was, had created strategic points around our entire camp. At one of these points, we found cigarette butts still smelling of smoke, which meant that our observer had been there very recently, perhaps minutes before. We decided not to follow the main trail back. Josh, who knew the region well, suggested that we take an alternative route that led to a secondary road where we could ask for help if we found a car. Halfway there, Sarah tripped and fell. When I bent down to help her, I noticed something shining on the floor. It was a small, old military brooch, all rusty. It looked decades old, but it was there, right in the middle of our escape route. Mike insisted we leave the brooch where it was, and I agree it was the best decision. There was something very wrong with that object being right there, as if someone knew exactly where we would try to escape. We managed to reach the secondary road after a tense 40-minute walk. Nobody spoke a word during the entire journey. We only communicated through gestures and looks. Every now and then, we heard branches snapping behind us, but no one had the courage to look back. When we finally reached the road, luckily, an elderly couple was driving by. They stopped to help, scared by our condition. The lady even insisted on calling the police when she saw how pale and sweaty we were, but we refused. What were we going to say? That someone had spent the whole night watching us and left gifts in our backpacks? Nobody would believe it. The most disturbing thing is what we discovered later. Once home, Mike researched the region where we camped and found some old reports from other campers who had similar experiences in the same place. In 1987, a group of students reported being watched all night by a mysterious figure who left small military objects near their belongings. The case was never solved. Sarah also discovered that that particular area of the park had been used for military training during World War II, and that some soldiers had mysteriously disappeared in the area. I don't know if I believe in these connections, but since that day, none of us have gone camping again. The truth is, I still have nightmares about that distant laugh, and every time I close my eyes, I can see that shadow standing outside the tent. Since then, there are some things I can't explain. For example, all the photos Mike took of the footprints simply disappeared from his phone. They weren't deleted. He swears he saved everything in the cloud as soon as he got home. They were simply gone, as if they had never existed. And here is more. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah found a pine branch identical to the one in her backpack in the backseat of her car. She was sure she had thrown the original away as soon as we arrived in town. Josh also started receiving strange calls from a blocked number. When he answered, all he could hear was the sound of wind and branches snapping, as if someone was walking through a forest. I've tried to rationalize all of this in 1,000 different ways. Maybe it was just some crazy person who likes to scare campers. Or maybe a local resident trying to scare people away from that area. But here is one thing that won't leave me alone. That military brooch we found. Last week, out of curiosity, I sent a photo of him, which Sarah had taken with her cell phone, to a specialist in military items. He responded by saying that that particular model was used by a single army unit that trained in that region in 1943, and that the entire unit had mysteriously disappeared during a nighttime exercise. I never posted anything about it anywhere again, and whenever someone suggests camping, I make up an excuse. Some things are better left alone, you know?